I'm Rosanna Smith, Manager of Brunel Public Policy and convener of this webinar series on Are regulators keeping up with the science? And welcome to today's webinar. So Brunel Public Policy is a unit that works across all of Brunel University of London, using our world-leading research to help inform policymakers, legislators and regulators. Within this webinar series, we explore the latest research from our university that highlights and addresses issues where policy and regulation may need to be updated and the challenges and issues in doing so. If you didn't make it to the first two webinars, in fact, on our regulations and government investment keeping up with agreed timelines to meet net zero targets, and on regulation and policy responses to a rapidly evolving major health emergency, there are, or there will be in just a moment, links to the reports and recordings in the Q&A section. Speaking of that Q&A section, we encourage you all throughout the talks to post any questions you have for the speakers, which our chair will then pose to them at the end of the talks. Please provide your name and organisation, and if you see any questions that you think are really good, please vote them upwards to really highlight them more to us to make sure they get through to the panel. We believe that today's webinar on Is regulation keeping up with developments and changing use of online digital communications comes at a really timely moment as the UK government and much of the world tries to get to grips with online misinformation, radicalisation and exploitation. And with that, I will now hand over to our chair, Professor Ashley Braganza.
Rosie, thank you for that introduction to the webinar today. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ashley Braganza. I'm a professor of organizational transformation. I'm also the co-director for the Center for AI, and I set up the center in 2018, in part because I felt that having seen a number of waves of technology come and go, this wave of AI and artificial intelligence and all the technologies that go around it was one that was going to have a significant impact, not just on companies, but also on society as we know it and on individuals and households. And so it is being played out almost now on a daily basis. I have to say, when I was chatting to Justin Fisher and to Rosie about this particular webinar, I have to say that never has there been a more timely webinar than the one looking at kind of regulation and the need for regulation in this space. I mean, if you've been following events in the last week, 10 days, but now Facebook saying that they are no longer going to be fact-checking, and it's now all going to be down to individuals and members of a community to keep track on whether news or any items are factually correct or causing concern. We begin to see that we are on the edge of a very slippery slope. And having spoken to and listened to the speakers as well, I think what you're going to hear is a very interesting set of comments. So I'd like to thank the speakers in advance for what they're going to share with us. Let me move on to the speakers. We have three. The running order is going to be first Dr. Nelli Ferenczi, then Dr. Bilal Özgul, and finally Dr. Zoe Krokida. So let me start with Nelli. Nelli's a senior lecturer in psychology and a member of the Center for Culture and Evolution. Her research focuses on the construction and maintenance of bicultural and multicultural identity, individual differences, and social context in online pro-social and antisocial behavior. Understanding the impact of marginalization on well-being and the self, and the role of groups on identity and behavior. And today, Nelli is going to talk about or address a question, which is, how do young adults make sense of online mundane extremism and harm? Nelli, over to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Ashley. Let me just share my slides. Perfect. So that should be sharing my slides now. And let me just bring up the meeting. So thank you very much and good afternoon. My name is Nelli Ferenczi, and today I'll be drawing on findings from 2 studies to reflect on how young adults make sense of online extremism and harm. And these studies were part of a much larger EU 2020 Horizon project across 15 countries and from 17 partners, which explored radicalization and polarization in Europe and beyond. So, why does it matter to study extremism and harms in digital context? We know that online harms are a broad term that encompass various negative experiences online, such as hate speech, harassment, purposeful embarrassment, trolling, and extremist content. And I'm using online harms as an umbrella term here for all of these various negative online experiences, which vary by person and by context. And this makes it a challenge to define what is online antisocial behavior, which then in turn makes it challenging to measure and capture. However, what we do know is that exposure to online harms is increasing over time, and this is particularly true for young people. For example, a recent analysis of online conversations has found that online hate speech has risen since the start of the pandemic. And in line with this, worryingly, over time, social media users are less likely to do or say something about the online harms that they come across. So is this a sign of desensitization or withdrawal? And in this vein, the EU Radicalization Awareness Network has identified young people as being at a higher risk of online radicalization. And all of this matters because of the impact of online harms. Online harms have a widespread and an insidious impact on many psychosocial outcomes. They can reduce online participation, which is particularly impactful for marginalized communities. And this can reduce the diversity of voices on social media. It can make people uncomfortable to go online or even lead them to avoid digital spaces. But in turn, because of our increasingly digital lives and the opportunities that digital spaces offer, online harms can be seen as a barrier to engagement and access. After all, today the internet, as Yvette Cooper put it, is our streets and our public spaces. In this way, online harms can lead to further isolation, and this is a rippling effect in that online antisocial behavior goes beyond targets and also affects bystanders, with people less likely to share something online after witnessing the abuse and harassment of others. So I will first discuss our findings in the context of how online group identities can predict support for extremist attitudes using findings from a quantitative survey. And then in the second part, I will focus on our interview findings and how young people conceptualize online harms and extremism. So with this in mind, we first wanted to explore how identifying with online groups predicts support for extremist attitudes. And we adopted a relational perspective, which took into account how our group identities and memberships, which provide us with a map to interpret the social world, shape perceptions of injustice, grievances, alienation, and polarization. And the model that we propose is quite complex. So today I'm only going to focus on the role of online group identity, which is the perceived belongingness and a psychological attachment to an online group. And I'll also be discussing extreme attitudes, which refers to the idealistic endorsement of comprehensive changes to the status quo, socially, culturally, societally, even at the expense of human coexistence. And as a brief note, this was a correlational survey study. We recruited participants across 16 national contexts, and we had a total of 4,599 participants complete the survey. And we conducted path analysis to look at the relationship between our variables. So what were our findings? First of all, having a strong attachment to one's online group was linked with increased perceived social alienation, populism, and collective narcissism, which is the belief that one's social group is exceptional and important and that this is unrecognized. And in turn, alienation, populism, and collective narcissism all predicted increased support for extremist attitudes. In other words, online group identity had significant indirect effects on extremist attitudes through these three variables. And this reveals the complex relationships between group identities and expectations of group hierarchies and relational, political, and vulnerability variables that in turn increase endorsement of extremist attitudes. And overall, these findings speak to the importance of social networks in the formation of such attitudes. So social networks can function as informational and normative influences in the maintenance of extremist attitudes by providing social support, validating narratives, and rewarding normative behavior in aid of a specific goal. And turning to lived experiences, we then wanted to look at how young people make sense of everyday encounters with online extremism and harms. And for this part of the study, we conducted 30 interviews with young people across 12 countries. And I'm going to focus on just 4 themes for my talk today. So first, our participants, particularly those with underrepresented or minoritized identities, experienced an amplification of othering in digital spaces. Participants experienced being minoritized or seeing others be minoritized. And one participant, for example, discussed the amount of hate speech that they were exposed to during the World Cup in terms of the reactions to the French team players. And in this way, participants saw hate as something that was hyper accessible. Minoritization happened across many different intersectional identities. And in this way, our participants felt that they were continuously reminded of their otherness or non-belonging. And this is particularly important when time spent online is increasing in Europe, with 96% of young people accessing the internet daily. So individuals are at an increased risk of being marginalized in the digital spaces that are part of their lives, or if they choose to withdraw from those spaces, they're also likely to lose out on the benefits of being connected online. And I also just wanted to highlight that our participants particularly noted right-wing narratives and ideologies as examples of extremism that they came across online. Our participants also saw online harms as something inevitable and everyday that they had to live with. For example, one respondent expressed how seeing sexism and homophobia online every day had desensitized them, noting that those days when you realize you don't actually feel anything because you just get so used to seeing a lot of the time, like you unfortunately become numb to it. Importantly, our participants also expressed concern at seeing polarization online. And they also spoke about how they perceived social media platforms that were associated with the other side or as having been taken over. And the response to this was to abandon reading those specific platforms. For example, participants identified Facebook and Twitter, or X, as having moved to the right. And in response to the overwhelming amount of online harms, participants simply adapted their feed to avoid them, or noted that they avoided all social media platforms because they might be targeted on them. So in order to counter these inevitable and everyday experiences, our participants suggested several tools, such as online moderation. But from our interviews, it emerged that in its current form, online moderation is not necessarily perceived as functioning effectively. And furthermore, our interviews highlighted the significance of education in order to increase felt responsibility and limit extremist language on online platforms, as demonstrated in this quote. Participants also highlighted that education could protect people from adopting extremist views online, and this supports other findings that the teaching of civic values and citizenship education are critical elements to containing online harms. So what are the implications? Taken together, our findings suggest that online group identities can reinforce certain narratives, which in turn can contribute to support for extremist attitudes. Indeed, one such narrative that online groups can provide and reinforce is that of in-group superiority relative to other outgroups, or collective narcissism, that a sense of meaninglessness or social alienation, which must be overcome, and disenfranchisement with the perceived elite political institutions or populism. Collectively, these narratives play a part in motives for endorsing extremist attitudes. Our interviews provide important insights into how online harms are understood, encountered, and made sense of by young people. Our findings also highlight the challenges of navigating online spaces and their impact on behavior, including engagement or withdrawal from these places of online conflict. And importantly, our respondents spoke to how online spaces can function as amplifiers of intergroup divisions and polarization through minoritization. Online spaces provide an additional risk for being exposed to online harms, sometimes vicariously and often in mundane ways. Relatedly, the narratives of our participants revealed desensitization to this content and perceptions that they were often insufficiently addressed by existing moderation practices. And education as a means of combating the impact of harms and decreasing their prevalence was raised by our participants, suggesting that current practices do not meet the evolving challenges unique to online spaces. And instead, most of our participants withdrew from particular online spaces or curated their content. And this latter poses risks in terms of contributing to the solidification of echo chambers, which can further feed into experiences of injustice, grievance, alienation, and polarization in a self-reinforcing cycle. And this is important to take into account, given that, as Ashley introduced recently, Meta has announced removing fact checkers, or one aspect of moderation, on Facebook and Instagram. So I just want to take a moment to thank all of the partners on the project, which you can see here, and specifically to also thank all of the team members for our specific work package. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions. I'll stop sharing now.
Nelli, excuse me. Thank you so much for getting us started with this really interesting presentation on online harms and sharing with us the data that you've got with from young adults. I certainly have a few questions to pick up on, but I would ask colleagues who are attending to please post your questions that have been raised in the Q&A section. Let's move on. Next up is Dr. Bilal Özgül. Bilal is a senior lecturer in political communication at Brunel University of London, and she's the coordinator of the Political Communication Master's Program. Her research interests are in the field of media and politics, with a particular focus on digital media, alternative media organizations, and social movements. She's the author of 2 monographs, Leading Protests in the Digital Age, Youth Activism in Egypt and Syria, and Psychology of Democracy. Today, Bilal is going to talk to us about analyzing anti-lockdown, anti-vaccine protesters' engagement with news, data, information, and misinformation about the COVID-19 pandemic. Bilal, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ashley. Let me share with you my screen as well, so that you can see my slides. Hopefully they are visible. Hi, everyone. Well, I'm going to talk today about our research on anti-lockdown and anti-vaccine protesters. And I'm going to particularly focus on one section of this research, which focuses on the engagement of protesters with news data and information sources about the pandemic and COVID-19 vaccine. But this is we have a much larger research on their collective identity and their the organization of the protests as well. But what I want to focus here is the reasons that they use specific information sources during the pandemic. We are composed of researchers from Brunel University of London, University of Sheffield, and Glasgow Caledonian University. Okay, sorry, let me just, sorry. So over 2020-2022, I'm sure you are remembering that we have seen the rise of first anti-lockdown and then anti-vaccine protests. The protesters were against socioeconomic constraints, the pandemic restrictions, and official health information from official sources. And this attitude against official health recommendations has been growing. In 2024, the health officials in the UK mentioned that the UK is at tipping point with low child vaccine uptake, which put children in high risk of severe diseases. So it is important that we actually understand why people turn against official health recommendations by official sources. So We did 33 semi-structured interviews with anti-vaccine protesters in 6 protest sites in London in 2021 and 2022. We used go-along interview method, which is an informal form of urban ethnography. And why this method? We basically joined the protests ourselves. We marched with the protesters and we asked our questions during the protests, which helped us to see their interaction and their reaction to political institutions as well as mainstream media organizations. And we asked participants several questions, some of which were what motivates them to join the protest, the type and nature of information they use, and how they heard about the protests. And our interviewees came from different cities in the UK and neighborhoods in London, and they worked in various professions. Some of them were teachers, doctors, nurses. We had builders, and they were between the ages of 19 to 66. So when we asked them where did they receive their information about the COVID-19 vaccine and the pandemic, they all mentioned that they prefer to do their own research on the internet and obtain their trusted health information through social media channels. Even those who are not big on social media, they mentioned that they at least use one social media channel regularly to be informed about the pandemic. So they used Facebook groups, Instagram, Twitter, newer social media platforms as well, TikTok and Telegram. And Telegram was particularly popular among protesters because they found it much more secure and private than WhatsApp groups because of its encrypted messaging opportunities and less strict content moderation as well. And they loved the hybrid nature of Telegram, and they organized the protests on Telegram, via Telegram as well. And they also use TikTok because they thought it's a very democratizing sphere because the TikTok algorithm, as you know, is different than other social media channels. So the the interviewees thought that people who don't have voice in other platforms can actually have voice in TikTok. They followed online influencers such as Rashid Battar, Gareth Ike, Joe Rogan, and they mentioned discredited and influencer medical doctors and that they follow them on YouTube. And among the websites that they focused were Infowar and podcasts such as Dark Horse, and they also use some WhatsApp groups as well on these issues. So we wanted to understand, why they turned against official sources, or mainstream media, and focused on alternative media channel. And previous research on alternative media show us that distrust towards mainstream media often turned the public towards alternative media channels. And political distrust refers to an attitude or feeling where people see the political system or its part as untrustworthy. And in our case, in the anti-lockdown and anti-vaccine protests, the protesters had very long-standing distrusts towards political mainstream media channels, institutions and elites, and pharmaceutical companies. So as in the beginning of the pandemic, they didn't trust the official sources, they turned to alternative media channels. And our interviewees mentioned that mainstream media is just echoing what elites mention anyway. And they feel excluded from these channels. So they were actually quite angry to mainstream media. And as they engage with information from alternative media channels, they also encounter with lots of conspiracy theories, particularly around COVID-19 vaccine. And this led to an increasing sense of anxiety among our interviewees. And we know from past research that discrete emotions have distinct effects on information processing. And particularly, anxiety is known to cause increased information search. So the conspiracy theories such as that COVID-19 vaccine is actually an unethical experiment on the community created lots of anxiety on parents particularly, who were hesitant to give this vaccine to their children, and they were terrified to think that they will need to give this vaccine basically to their children. So, and they did more research on these issues, and they led to wider endorsement of non-conspiracy theories as well. And we wanted to understand, why specific groups have this distrust towards official health information and official sources as well. So we did a further study on vaccine hesitancy, vaccine hesitant groups in minoritized communities in the UK and the US. And in this study, we argued that in order to understand why specific communities turn against official information sources, we actually need specific research on these communities, because specific communities might have specific reasons that they distrust official sources. For example, we did interviews with Black British people who are, some of them were vaccine hesitant, and they recall historical medical racism, such as Tuskegee studies in the US, which are unethical studies on Black community in the US in the past. And they also recall their own example of racism, so their experiences of racism in contemporary medical institutions, or their parents' experiences. And all these experiences, of course, decrease their level of trust in medical institutions. They were also concerning towards the COVID-19 vaccines perceived side effect to different body compositions. So they weren't sure how COVID-19 vaccine will have an impact on Black bodies. So all these concerns prevented them to really listen only the official sources, but they also did their own research on social media channels. But in addition to social media, vaccine hesitant groups in minoritized communities also relied a lot on in-person discussions. And they prefer to talk, to have these discussions with trusted religious authorities. So it is important that official information sources also create relations with trusted religious authorities, actually, in order to reach out to these communities and inform them. So all in all, what we see here is that the authoritative information is important, and of course it is crucial, but not enough to meet the challenge of online misinformation, because not everyone is really, focusing on information coming from a mainstream media channels, for instance. So online channels is important here, but deplatforming user from online channels is also not a solution, or removing a content. Although they proved effective to tackle the spread of misinformation, of course, they are not sufficient, because people who are deplatforms migrate to new platforms. And our participants mentioned that they have been using multiple platforms to reach out information, so they found the information when they want. And deplatforming makes users feel that they are censored and ultimately isolated, so they feel excluded, and this also makes them even more alienated from political mainstream. And so information disseminators can play an important role in building trust with these communities, such as journalists, medical practitioners, political actors, but they need community-specific guidelines, which will explain them the cultural sensitivity of these groups, their social and political experiences, and care should be at the core of these trainings of information disseminators, if you want to actually build trust with different communities and make sure that they actually listen to the official health recommendations. Thank you very much. Let me stop my sharing.
Thank you again for a really fascinating talk, and I think we're all familiar with the whole anti-vaccine movement and some of the arguments that were raised, which I think you captured really well, and the effects of which you captured really well in your research and the presentation you've just made. So thank you for that. A reminder again to add your comments and questions in the Q&A section, and to use the little up arrow at the bottom of each comment to register if you like that question, and I'll take those in the order in which the ones that have the most votes in effect. Let me move on. Zoe is a lecturer in AI, innovation and law at Brunel University of London. She's also an International Research Fellow at the Information Society Law Center of the University of Milan. She's the co-investigator of a research grant on the project of social media facilitated trafficking of children and young people by the ESRC Vulnerability and Policing Futures Research Center. Her research interests include IP law, new technologies, ISP regulatory frameworks, online defamation, and responsible use of AI technologies. And the title of Zoe's presentation today is Social Media Facilitated Trafficking of Children and Young People. Zoe, over to you. Zoe, you're on mute. You're on mute.
Oh, I'm sorry for this. Thank you so much for the introduction and invitation to this webinar. Let me share my slides. So I can see that. I hope that you can see them. So this presentation, my presentation, is about social media, how social media facilitate trafficking of children and young people. This presentation is based on a research project where I'm a co-investigator, a project funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. The PI of this project, Laura Bahon, is from Liverpool John Moores University. She's a criminologist, and the other two also co-investigators are criminologists. I'm the only one who is a lawyer, has a law background, so a lecturer in law. So this presentation, this project has been completed in December 2024. It is relevant in light of the Online Safety Act in the UK, an act that imposes a set of obligations to social media platforms to foster a safe online environment. So to give you a background of this research project, so undoubtedly internet has a widespread accessibility. It has been reported by Ofcom that 97% of the UK households with children aged from 0 to 18, they have internet access. On the other hand, social media platforms can offer venues for traffickers to and facilitate trafficking activities online. It has been reported that due to all these trafficking activities, there is a risk for internet users with a focus on children and young people on their well-being and safety online. There has also been a recognition that technological developments in social media, so for instance, like new business models for social media platforms, new features in social media settings, along with the lack of effective detection and preventive mechanisms, this might run a risk for children's and young people's safety online. In light of this, the research team, we have identified that there is a lack of empirical understanding how traffickers use social media in order to identify and potential victims, as well as the level of preparedness of law enforcement agencies, NGOs, and governmental agencies, how to respond to these challenges. So the objectives of this research project is to advance the empirical understanding of the use of social media in the exploitation of children and young people, explore the level of preparedness, as I said before, and also engage with practitioners to understand potential challenges and and offer a set of recommendations how to overcome these challenges. In order to achieve these objectives, we have distributed in targeted networks in England and Wales survey with open and closed questions, and organized last year a focus group with 12 participants from law enforcement agencies, from NGOs and governmental associations, in order to discuss further the findings of the survey and address potential challenges and reflect and understand provide a set of recommendations for overcoming those challenges. So today I will present a number of findings. For instance, the first one is about the use of social media. Participants in the survey and the focus group reported that social media are used across all phases of the process of exploitation. So from targeting the potential victims and controlling them over the exploitation. So it has been reported that there are ways of active and passive targeting. Through active targeting through open accounts of social media, some users, children and young people, they leave their accounts open. They don't use the privacy settings. Through friendship groups and common friends, while also with regard to passive targeting, traffickers participants reported that traffickers tend to use social media in order to advertise a glamorized lifestyle. For instance, it is easy, earning money is easy, so they use social media in order to advert their glamorized lifestyle and therefore attract children and young people. Through the social media also they can foster trust by having access to their interests, activities, their hobbies. They can build trust throughout within children and young people and therefore attract to illegal activities. And also through social media, participants reported that they can still control children and young people over the exploitation phase. For instance, in the context of county lanes, participants reported in the focus group that messages and videos, violent videos, have been sent as a threat to children and young people. And also in terms of sexual exploitation, participants in the focus group reported that threats for posting compromising images and videos online have been sent to the victims. Another interesting finding is about the use of different social media platforms for different crime stages and purposes. For instance, in the survey, it has been reported that, for instance, YouTube is used mainly by traffickers to glamorize their lifestyle, while Snapchat is used for sending messages, videos, and in order to control the victims over the exploitation. It has also been found in the focus in the survey that there are diverging views in terms of social media prevalence and in trafficking activities, in facilitating trafficking activities. So the law enforcement agencies reported that 55% of the cases that involved trafficking, trafficking activities, they also involved social media, while NGOs reported that 25% of the trafficking cases also involved the prevalence of social media. Another interesting find is about viewing social media as a facilitator of exploitation. Participants at the focus group reported a few significant factors for this. Social media were seen as a vast pool, and traffickers could, at low effort and low risk, with minimal cost and monitoring, they can recruit their victims, identify them, as I explained before, and they can hide through anonymity, and it's very difficult for law enforcement agencies to track them. Other significant factors is the access and affordability. Social media, they offer a sense of belonging they offer a sense of belonging to minors, and at the same time, through all these videos and images, minors, they are exposed to some images, to violent images. So in that way, they can normalize certain behaviors and lifestyle. And this is coupled with the low perception of risk online that the minors had. So at the survey and also in the focus group, social media have been seen as as a facilitator of exploitation of children and young people. There is a risk. In the focus group, a number of challenges have been reported by the participants. For instance, in order to respond to the trafficking activities online, participants reported a lack of resources and capabilities. They also reported limited training at organizational level. 47% of the participants at the focus group reported that they didn't have their organizations. They don't have any training at all, while others, 66% of the participants reported that in their organizations there are established formal procedures in order to respond. In terms of legislation, in light of the Online Safety Act, participants at the focus group reported that the Online Safety Act is ineffective as it currently stands, because it fails to provide an answer to the children and young persons trafficking. It mainly focuses on sexual abuse of children, and there is lack of reference to other controlling and exploitative behavior. And while the concept of harmful content can be open to different interpretations. Finally, another challenge has been identified about the lack of engagement with social media companies, and all participants have reported that social media are dynamic and changing with new features, privacy features, new settings, and this makes it very difficult, challenging for the law enforcement agencies to detect, to identify traffickers. Finally, a set of recommendations have been set in the focus group, enhancing, for instance, more evidence-based knowledge about the social media use, improve engagement and collaboration between law enforcement and social media companies, platforms, and finally, identify some early identification mechanisms in order to prevent and identify individuals, minors that are at risk. This was my presentation. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you for sharing with us your research and findings on what is a horrendous topic, and yet it affects so many children and young people on a global level. We'll now move to the Q&A. There are various questions that have been posted. Some that have been directed at individuals, but some which are kind of more general. Let me start with the general questions first, and then we'll try to run through as many as we can in the next 10, 12 minutes or so. So if I could ask you to keep your answers quite concise. The first question I'm going to come to is from an anonymous user, but signed GCAT. It's spelled with a K. So although it says both presentations, but I think all three of your presentations refer to dilemmas regarding what and whom to trust, because I think you all kind of mention trust in your own ways. This is becoming an increasing issue as those that lead don't seem to demonstrate integrity. So here's the question. How do you all believe we can even begin to address the issue of trust? Who would like to pick up on this issue of trust? Hello, do you want to get us started?
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you for the question, and I think it's very important. Yes, I agree that those that lead didn't seem to demonstrate integrity, particularly during the pandemic. We saw, confusing, contradictory messages from politicians and medical institutions, which further confused, for instance, our interviewees during the pandemic period. So it is important that there is a clear and transparent unified messages from official sources, first of all. And it is also important that they communicate with communities and they know their concerns as well. So where we need to begin is, first of all, there needs to be a bottom-up relation, really, which shows what the communities really needs to hear, what their concerns are, and so that the officials can know, how they can actually build this trust with these communities.
Sure, thank you. Nelli, well, any thoughts on this issue of trust?
Yes. Well, I mean, taking the responses from our interviews, many of our respondents actually highlighted that a lot of their experiences of, let's say, mundane hate speech actually came from or was within the context of those that they should trust, so leaders of political parties, for example, or of institutions. So it's a really good question, but I have to say that it's a really difficult question to answer. What we're seeing is that I suppose what Bilur said, that we have to start from the bottom up, but also really reevaluating the messaging or the stances that these institutions take, because a lot of the hate content and hate speech that we saw in extremist mundane content was actually within these contexts that are coming from places of trust, or if they're not coming from places of trust, there was a lack of effective moderation. So actually a lot of our participants, their response was, if there's not going to be effective moderation, then I either have to curate it myself, and therefore resulting in increased siloing and increased echo chambers, or I have to withdraw completely from the platforms. So yes, that's my response.
Thank you. Zoe, your thoughts on this one, please.
So, based on the recommendations with regard to the traffic to social media facilitating trafficking in children and young people, one of the recommendations actually at the focus group of the participants noted that although despite the fact that the social media platforms, they have a corporate responsibility to offer an online environment, a safe online environment, more research should be done, and more should be done in terms of offering a supportive spaces for children and young people to discuss their online interactions, to offer more support and more trusted places for online interactions, because it has been reported that there were minors at risk, that they didn't engage, they didn't report trafficking activities online. So promoting trust, offering supportive places where minors can discuss with their guardians and adults their online interactions could enhance trust online.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to thank you for sharing your answers. Given the number of questions we now have, I might just come to one or two of you rather than come to all, just so we can cover a wider range of the questions. I think the question came up, Nelli, when you were presenting, because it was talking about extremism and harm with reference to young adults, but I think it also, potentially reflects something that you discuss. I'll come to the two of you for this next one. It's a question from Federico, and it says, should the approach, i.e. we're talking about the role that AI can play in mitigating risk and how regulations are formed, should the approach be top-down, for example, driven by government authorities, bottom-up, driven by society, potentially even driven by the market, or somewhere in between? Nelli?
That is a very good question. I would say, I think I've actually been looking at the QA, and it seems that there's a lot of good questions. I wish we had the time to answer them all, but just very quickly, I would say that the approach has to be somewhere in between. We can see certainly from the interviews that we have that the current approach is not working. Again, in terms of in terms of AI, we need to be also careful in terms of the existing biases that are present in the application of AI. And we know that there are biases in the way that in the responses of LLMs. So I think that you need to have moderation both from the bottom up. As we can see, young people, taken from interviews, young people know what they want. They know what kind of tools would be helpful in decreasing their exposure to online harms or eliminating them. But we also need a top-down regulation as well.
Great, thank you. Below?
Thank you for the question. I think it's a very difficult question as well. Thank you. Well, I also agree with Nelly. The approach needs to be somewhere in between. Top-down regulation is also important because we know that the more we see conspiracy theories, the more people, become anxious and they do more research and they engage more with conspiracy theories. So it is important to stop at least the increased level of conspiracy theories on social media channels, and for this regulation from top down is also important. But we also know that there are multiple platforms that communities use today. So it's not possible to regulate all type of information, all the misinformation as well. Research on the vaccine, COVID-19 messages on social media channels show that majority of misinformation about COVID-19 vaccines are still available on these social media channels, although there were lots of regulations that although we expected to have them regulated. So it's not always possible to mitigate this issue with just regulation from top down. It's important. That's why it's important that it's also driven by society, and that the society is also more educated, and that the officials create trust relations with these communities in order to be able to have an influence on them in the future. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for that, Bilal. The next question it picks up on the theme of education quite broadly, and you'll have all mentioned it, but I'll come, Zoe, to you and to Nelli, particularly as Nelli, the question was originally directed at you. But the question is about boomers, baby boomers, who are swayed by misinformation and disinformation and conspiracy theories. And so the question is there research focusing on older people and the education of older people? And I know, Zoe, you talked about companies having almost no training in education in particular, but is there any research that the two of you have come across that focuses on older people who have not grown up with media literacy? Zoe, if I come to you first.
Thank you very much for this question. To be honest, I didn't come across a research study so far that is a focus on old people. It's mainly certain specific groups, age groups. In terms of online harms, though, and in terms of, for instance, another part of my research is about copyright infringements online and intellectual property rights infringements online, and usually what I notice is that the suggestion for more awareness is presented in terms of policy recommendation, more awareness about what is meant by online harms, by what is meant by unauthorized content online, unauthorized online content. So awareness is certainly something that needs to be achieved, and also with regard to the recommendations that I have presented for the project where I'm a co-investigator, more awareness, collaboration with schools, for instance, and internet service providers in order to overcome online harm could be suggested.
Great, thank you. Nelli, briefly on this one?
Yes, very briefly. So, I mean, what I would say is that I think in certain types of online harms, and I'm sure Bilal can speak to this as well, there is research, so particularly in terms of conspiracy and misinformation, there is research for older, in terms of looking at older participants. I have to say, in terms of the questions that we asked, the online harms in terms of hate speech, there's relatively little research in terms of how individuals conceptualize these concepts, young and older. One point I did want to pull out is that I actually think that there are similarities in terms of media literacy, in that we make this assumption that younger people who have grown up with exposure to social media have greater media literacy. But what we're actually seeing is that our respondents noted that we need to have education as one of the tools to combat online harm. So we can't make the equivalence of being exposed to social media growing up in the digital world equates to online literacy or media, social media literacy. So actually, that is one aspect that we need more research on for both young and older people.
Okay, great, thank you. So I'm giving you a bit of forewarning. There is a question that I'm going to ask all three of you. You will have less than 20 seconds each to answer. So start thinking. Are there any particular surprises from your research? That's the question I'm going to come to. Just before I do, Nelli, there's one question, the first one that came up from Ali, which was, are there any major factors that you thought would be relevant in terms of the research you've done in terms of alienation, collective narcissism, etc.? Are there any factors that you thought would be relevant but turned out to be inconsequential? Just very briefly.
Very briefly. That is a very good question. The model is quite complex, so I actually focused on 1/3 of the model. There's quite a few factors here that were linked that I didn't mention, but I would say two variables that we were surprised didn't predict extremist attitudes was anomie, or this feeling that the social fabric of society is unraveling. We didn't find a correlation here, and the other factor was perception of an individual's sense of relative deprivation. So perceiving that someone's economic status is worse off than other outgroup members, and we focused on migrants. So we were expecting that this would link to supporting extremist ideology, so feeling that one's own economic situation is worse off than migrants in the country. But again, we didn't find this association. So those are the two factors.
Great, thank you. So 20 seconds, possibly now even 15 seconds each. Are there any surprises from your research? I'll go in reverse order. Zoe.
So it is one of the limitations actually in the project. So while the project was included all forms of exploitation, participants mainly focused on criminal exploitation and not on child sexual exploitation. So this could be further research that we would like to explore in our upcoming projects.
Okay, thank you. Bilo, any surprises?
Hi. Yeah, I think Nelli actually mentioned one of the surprises that we had is the level of education doesn't really explain us who will really engage with conspiracy theories, which was a surprise for us. And we saw that we thought the protesters who joined the anti-vaccine protest would be more from far-right ideologies, but we saw heterogeneous groups, people from different backgrounds who didn't really trust official recommendations from medical institutions and political parties.
Thank you. And Nelli, final word to you. Any surprises?
Yes, and perhaps it shouldn't be a surprise, but yet again, I was very surprised by the prevalence of online harms and the extent of online harms that all of our participants could recount very, very easily and at length. And tied to this, actually, what was surprising was the level of withdrawal or curation of the content, and therefore, increasing echo chambers. The participants were aware that this is what they were doing, but that was the sacrifice they were willing to make to ensure their own well-being. Those are the two biggest surprises for us.
Great, thank you. I'm looking at the clock in the bottom right-hand corner of my screen. It says 2:01, which means we've overrun by a minute, and I know Rosie wants to put some final words on. Firstly, let me thank the speakers for their excellent presentations of fielding the questions so well. The overrunning on the clock is purely down to the very poor chairing on my part. So apologies in advance, but I couldn't stop the speakers in terms of some of the questions that they were asking. But Rosie, over to you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, just to finish with a big thank you to all the speakers for such great thought-provoking talks that really highlighted such pertinent issues, and also to Ashley and you, the audience, for helping us to explore the issues raised, especially those around trust, online silos, education in online harms, and bias in the methods that should safeguard or regulate against these online harms. Just to highlight, we ran this series to highlight the type of research that we're doing at Brunel that really can tap into more regulation or policy change that is needed. I think this today and the earlier two webinars really highlighted that. Our report and recording will be available online soon. See the link in the chat. And if you want to be involved in future events like this, please do get in touch with us, especially if you have an idea from your research that could lead an event of this nature. Thank you all. That's all from us today. Goodbye.